So, good evening and thank you for coming. Yeah, idealism. So, idealism says that fundamentally reality is mental, which kind of sounds like a silly idea in like our modern enlightened day and age. Kind of like some new age woo, or I don't know, just some hippie talk. So let's find out. But before we can talk about idealism, we need to talk about its antithesis, physicalism, kind of the reigning metaphysical belief system. And then from there we can slowly move towards like more daring ideas on what the fundamental structure of reality could be. And then a little short history on idealism. So as with all of these ideas in philosophy, they go back quite some time. And yeah, why are we talking about this today? Because there's an interesting kind of renaissance in idealist thinking in philosophy and also some scientists. So that's kind of the reason why this is still a topic and people talk about this. And so I'll introduce some of the idealist thinkers and philosophers and scientists. And then a bit on like what this means as a metaphysical concept, like how can we understand it or not. And then I'll present like one sort of special version of idealism. So, physicalism, or it used to be called materialism, is kind of the belief that reality is fundamentally physical, so it's tangible. Every phenomena can be reduced to its physical processes and its interactions, and there are no non-physical aspects to reality. So rationality and common sense reign. And kind of that's all there is to say. So we know that there's like 4 forces in the universe. We know about the matter particles. So basically, this is quantum fields and how these quantum fields interact. We should be able to understand everything, life and consciousness. And if we don't yet, we surely will, because this is the right way of thinking about stuff rationally. So if anyone disagrees, you're either anti-science or deluded, or I don't know, you have naive ideas, or this is kind of wishful thinking. So, like, why do people start to think that this is not maybe kind of the final word on the structure of reality? So up to 1905, it made a lot of sense to think that physicalism was the right way, the right metaphysics to think about reality, because up to 1905, the world or our universe was this clockwork. You kind of understood the little wheels and stuff, and that's kind of how the universe ticks. And suddenly in 1 year, everything got turned on its head when relativity theory started. So kind of like having time being observer dependent, and that there's like nothing happens simultaneously. It always depends on like how like things are moving relative to each other. That seems like a really weird concept. And then you have the quantum world, which really kind of posed a lot of sort of fundamental existential questions. So we have this notion of duality. So depending on how you look at reality or particles, yeah, they're particles or they're waves. They have different properties, but it kind of like, so which is it? Like you have this superposition where they're like the spin of electrons is in all different like directions everywhere at the same time, and you can actually use that to do the quantum computing. So it's like it's a real sort of resource of reality, these kind of these weird attributes or uncertainty, that there's actually a limit of how much information you can retrieve from reality. And it's not because you're bad at like getting information, but there's a fundamental limit to physics that tells you can't like know 2 things exactly. So either you know where a particle is, but you don't know how quick it or how fast it's moving, or vice versa, which again seem like very weird and like nonsensical attributes of reality. Or like tunneling. This is like an age-old sort of quantum experiment where all these quantum particles are just kind of described by probabilities. So there's like a non-zero probability for everything to be everywhere the whole time, which means that even if you have like this like if you throw a stone into a well, it'll never be outside because like it wouldn't have the energy to get out. But quantum particles can like magically tunnel through these walls because it's a probability thing and appear on the other side of actually something which they shouldn't be able to get through. So again, like this makes no sense on a classical level. And non-locality, where this entanglement, you touch something here, and then you change an attribute over there, and it can be like on two parts, like across the universe. So, but you can't like kind of transmit information, so it still kind of obeys the rules of relativity, but it does seem to be like there's a non-local effect. There's like somehow stuff is sort of combined or interacting in a way which we don't really understand when we kind of try and look at it from space and time. And kind of the biggest problem in quantum mechanics is the measurement problem. As soon as you like go and, so if you don't look, you have these like clouds of superposition where it's like doing everything, and as soon as you measure it, it goes into one specific state. And how this happens, we still don't really know. It's so like, is it connected to consciousness or not? But basically it's again about information retrieval. As soon as you know something about the particle, it kind of manifests and becomes real in a physical sense. And if you look away again, it does all this weird quantum superposition stuff where it's kind of doing everything at the same time. And kind of more newer sort of quantum experiments show that there's this idea of contextuality, which says kind of like the way you do the experiment, you're actually putting these attributes onto the thing you're measuring, so it's kind of questioning kind of the objectivity of nature. So that's kind of weird. That kind of doesn't seem to fit into kind of this physicalist sort of rational, commonsensical point of view. And it gets worse because in kind of this complexity theory. So why do we see self-organization and emergence? So emergence is suddenly a system does new stuff which isn't kind of, which you can't understand if you sort of try and analyze the individual parts in the system. So it's, yeah, like our brain, where suddenly like from an animal brain to a human brain, you start to have this different modes of cognition, and then you start to think about the meaning of life and whatever, which kind of wasn't there before, or kind of like swarming behavior, where kind of each individual part of the system doesn't really know what it's doing, but as a whole it starts to kind of function and have this kind of intelligence which you don't really see in the individual parts. And yeah, I mean, life, kind of these 3.7 billion years of this homeostasis, if you think about it, it's like eternal self-replication and assembly of complex molecular like machinery over this like long time span. So you would think, we would really actually like to know how this works in detail. And as I said, physicalism is just like the black box saying, yeah, in theory we can, or we will understand it because we kind of know what goes in, but there's like no really sort of, I don't know, compelling sort of explanations for this. And consciousness kind of like is sort of the biggest problem. So David Chalmers with the hard problem of consciousness, where the question is, how can stuff that is non-mental suddenly like display mental attributes? So the clash between like this objective description of reality with science and our personal internal sort of perspective into reality, they somehow don't go together. And this hard problem has been around since 1994 or 5. And still today, this is like one of the biggest sort of reasons why people are thinking about looking at sort of alternative metaphysical ideas, because somehow in this kind of rational physicalist sort of context, consciousness just seems to be really not ideally explainable at all. So, and to continue, I mean, we kind of think that physics and science explains like everything. It does, it explains a lot, and we have technology, it works, science is amazing. But if you think about reality as kind of a box, so science figures out the stuff inside, but like, I don't know, on the edges, kind of like the foundations, we don't really know what's happening there. And it's kind of quite existential because we don't really know what time is in physics, which not many physicists will kind of tell you about, but time is a problem, and our two best kind of theories of the big and small, they don't come together. that's kind of quantum physics and general relativity don't come together as a unified mathematical framework. And this is why we had string theory, which was a load of math, which didn't really, 30 years of string theory didn't really bring that much. We still don't know like more about the fundamental nature of reality. And then we figured out that like the universe is expanding at an accelerated rate. So there must be stuff that we cannot see, and first scientists or physicists called this dark matter, and they thought it was like I don't know, a fifth of the stuff in the universe. And then suddenly we figured out, there's like even more like dark energy, which is like even weirder, and it's doing stuff and we can measure it. But now actually physicists are like, maybe this isn't true at all, which means that it's like a total, like we have no clue about like what's happening on cosmological scales. So this is like, these are like new things that are popping up that people are like dark matter has been around for I don't know how many decades, and like there's so many theories and makes a lot of sense. And now suddenly it seems like actually maybe this wasn't even a thing. And if you think about the vacuum, it's like emptiness, right? Well, emptiness doesn't exist because the vacuum is full of energy. And if you zoom in, because of this uncertainty, even if it's empty, it's not, because you have these quantum particles pop into existence and go out of existence again without violating any physics. John Wheeler called this the quantum foam. So if you think about it, if you zoom into empty space, it suddenly starts to froth and like do all this crazy stuff of like particles coming into existence and going out of existence, which again seems very weird from this kind of classical perspective we have, where it's like, no, this is empty, there's nothing happening here. And like the effects of this is, you can measure that, it's like the Casimir effect, and I mean, this is like physics. And some new theories are kind of what's becoming more established is that maybe space and time are kind of emergent properties. So there's something more fundamental behind space and time. And this is becoming more of a thing in theoretical physics. And sorry, if you're starting to tell me that space and time are not fundamental and there's something behind that, again, like, if you then try and convince me that this is logical, common sense, and I should understand it, I'm kind of skeptical. And even things like a proton, where it like textbook is like, oh, that's 3 quarks, we know. But that's not true, because that was like from far away. And nowadays we can like probe even deeper, and then it's like with the vacuum, it just starts to explode with all these gluons and froth and quarks and antiquarks. So looking at the proton really close is like a big mess. And then like, I don't know, infinity, is that even a thing? And there should be equal amounts of antimatter, that's more technical, we don't know why, and there isn't. And with the James Webb Telescope, we're seeing a lot of stuff that makes no sense to what the Hubble telescope was showing us, which led to a crisis in cosmology, which is ongoing. And the fine-tuning problem, so everything, all the constants in nature, and like, I don't know, the size of the electron to the proton, if you change any of these values, we don't get this. So there's either no structure, or everything clumps together, or it's just kind of like the universe we're in, everything kind of seems to be fine-tuned. Again, there's like philosophical ways of like saying, that's not a problem, don't worry. And kind of this idea of the book of nature that like, why does mathematics work? So the formal things we come up with in our minds, mathematics, seems to be like decoding what the universe is doing. Why should there be a correspondence between, like, if I throw a stone and the kind of the motion it has, why should that be related to calculus? Like, what's happening there where kind of, it's still kind of, it's just a brute fact of reality, but like, why is there this kinship between like our inner thinking and like the structure of the outer universe? And why consciousness and why anything? So a lot of existential puzzles. Reality is like super weird, and I don't know, we maybe should sort of be more candid about this when we are trying to think about what is the right sort of metaphysical system to think about reality. And this quote from Markus Müller from 4 years ago. So he works with the group of Anton Zeilinger, who won the Nobel Prize 2 years ago for his work on quantum information theory. And Müller is like, according to our current conception of physics, any valid physical theory is supposed to describe the objective evolution of a unique external world. Of course. However, this condition is challenged by quantum theory, which suggests that physical systems should not always be understood as having objective properties which are simply revealed by measurement. I mean, like, what is he saying that, like, objectivity went out of the window? And this is like, yeah, I mean, he's a theoretical physicist. This is not like some philosophical musings, or this is like the thing he's doing, what they're doing, which is kind of pointing them in this direction, that the idea of like, this is contextuality. The way you do your experiment, you kind of put these attributes into the thing you're measuring, which, again, makes no sense at all from our classical logical perspective. So, science tells us how things work. It doesn't tell us what it is. And this is very important because, and then on the other hand, metaphysics is the thing which starts where physics ends. So metaphysics cannot be proven or disproven. So if you have good metaphysical ideas, they do not crash with anything in science. So that's kind of the main attribute of kind of your metaphysical system. It has ideas which can be true or cannot, and no one knows. So physicalism is a philosophical belief. This does not come out of science. There's no way, there's no equation or nothing in the edifice of science that tells you that physicalism is the right way to look at reality. And as we've seen, actually it seems to be that reality is telling us that it's actually the other way around. Like, rationality, common sense don't seem to be things that the universe, reality is very concerned about. And the problem started with physicists being confronted with this quantum weirdness, and these quantum pioneers, they were like really sort of trying to engage with what this means and the craziness. And then the next generation was like, hey, forget it, shut up and calculate, do the math. You understand things, you can build technology, you can have all the great stuff, and just don't worry about these like philosophical musings. Which means that kind of most physicists either think philosophy is irrelevant or stupid. And that's really bad, because then you have physicists who are very ignorant in terms of metaphysics. And as a result, physicalism kind of went under the radar and never was exposed as what it is. It's a metaphysical belief. It's not something you have to adopt if you like science and think that's the correct thing to do. And kind of as an example I gave was, it's kind of a quote people think came from Feynman, like one of the greatest physicists. And he said that ornithology is as important to birds as the philosophy of science is to scientists. Which is such a stupid thing to say. I mean, if you think about it, like in the philosophy of science, you're asking like, what can I know? What's the structure of reality? What is a law of nature? And how can you like be a serious physicist and think that this is a waste of time? So kind of that was a bit of the problem here, that kind of physics and philosophy, they kind of, they diverged, and there wasn't really, they weren't really working together in kind of trying to address what is the correct underlying thought system to understand reality. But slowly we are looking at newer or kind of more funky ideas. Panpsychism is something which is quite en vogue. So the idea here is that consciousness is fundamental, and it's ubiquitous and incremental, so it's everywhere. And kind of quoting Freeman Dyson, who was one of a great theoretical physicists of the 20th century, and he once said, mind is already inherent in every electron. So it's panpsychism is like, you have the sparkle of like consciousness everywhere. But basically what you're doing is you're taking physicalism, you're taking the thing you can't understand, consciousness, and you're putting it in and defining it as like one of the things you can't define, the ontological primitive. So you're putting the thing you can't describe as part of the things that are there from the beginning. So, yeah, you can do that, of course, but I don't know. You maybe can do better. But it's quite popular at the moment because of Christoph Koch and Giulio Tononi, two neuroscientists. So Koch is one of the pioneering neuroscientists, and their idea of integrated information theory, which says the more information is like being processed in some device, the bigger the chance that this suddenly starts to have an inner perspective, which implies panpsychism. And then you have philosophers of mind like Philip Goff, who in 2021 or 2019 kind of wrote about this and popularized this. And what panpsychism really did, it really opened the floodgates to like more crazy and more radical metaphysical thinking. And the question is, okay, if consciousness is fundamental, why stay with panpsychism? Why not go all in and move to metaphysical idealism, which says consciousness is all there is? So it's a monist philosophy. And yeah, reality is fundamentally mental. So the physical is derived or contingent, which yeah raises a lot of eyebrows if you're kind of coming from a physicalist point of view. And so what we're talking about here is that somehow there seems to be like two sort of mental aspects to reality. One is kind of your personal mental process, our individual kind of thing we have now, we're perceiving. And then you have these transpersonal mental processes, which are in idealism kind of what's behind kind of the physical, which is kind of like propping it up, which is sort of allowing this to exist. So it kind of comes to the question of like, yeah, cosmic consciousness and kind of this sort of, again, sort of this idea of, well, but this is all like new age stuff. Like, should we take this seriously? So, a brief history. While shamanism isn't technically an idealist view, it's kind of I mean, it's really acknowledging that there is a spiritual reality that you can access with your consciousness through altered modes of consciousness. So yeah, shamanism being like one of the oldest sort of religions in that sense. So this was there from the very beginning when humans started to like, yeah, think about sort of the bigger picture, and that kind of this spirit world is a real thing and you can visit it. And then in Hinduism, there's like the concept of Brahman, which is like ultimate reality, the universal self, and Atman, which is the personal self. So again, this kind of dichotomy between sort of transpersonal, everything, and the personal self. But then sometimes Hinduism goes full on non-dual and says, Atman is Brahman, so what? So trying sort of putting these together. And then don't forget that there was like Soma, this psychedelic potion, which was probably influential in the kind of the genesis of kind of this sort of spiritual tradition. And there's also some schools in Buddhism that are idealist, where you have to say there's also some other schools which are more materialist.
But the Buddha said mind matters most.
Yeah, but there's still like certain schools that are more like, no, we should like focus more on kind of, well, not technically materialist, but just kind of more sort of negating kind of this full idealist sort of thing. I would have to look it up which ones they are, but it's like there's sort of a bit of a divergence there. And then Plato, who kind of had this idea that there's this abstract level of pure forms from which like our physical reality springs. And yeah, Plato being like the biggest influence or kind of like, yeah, the biggest name in Western philosophy. And again, don't forget, there was this psychedelic drink called kykeon in the Eleusinian Mysteries, where so Plato again maybe is talking about something he experienced firsthand and not just thought about like in abstract terms. And then we have mystic traditions. So in the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim religions. And it's interesting because, like, traditionally these Abrahamic monotheistic religions tell you that there's an external God, you have to kind of obey this external authority. But the mystics turned this around and made it all about your personal interaction with the divine. This was like the central thing of what these mystics kind of were talking about. And especially in the Kabbalah and Sufism, there's like very detailed descriptions of these non-physical levels of reality. And then we have George Berkeley, who really presented a very robust and well thought out sort of idealist philosophy. It wasn't called idealism then, he called it immaterialism. And basically was thinking that reality is made up from mind-dependent ideas. So he was Bishop Berkeley, so for him it was like reality is happening in the mind of God. And Leibniz, so we'll know Leibniz more as a mathematician, he synchronistically came up with calculus the same time Newton did. And he kind of introduced his philosophy of monadology. So he said these realities made up of these monads, which are like mind-like, irreducible substances. And kind of, I mentioned John Wheeler, who sort of is the physicist who came to think about that maybe reality is more of an informational theoretic thing than a physical thing. And actually Wheeler was really influenced by Leibniz's philosophy, so he really kind of liked this idea of what Leibniz was kind of metaphysically thinking about. And then, yes, Immanuel Kant, so he was maybe the first sort of idealist philosopher. He was influenced by Berkeley and Leibniz. And it's kind of like more complicated because he was saying that there's the noumenon, which is the thing itself, which you can never know or touch, but then there's the phenomenon, the thing we live in. And the phenomenon is made up of mind-dependent stuff. So space, time, matter, causality, rationality, these are all constructs of the mind. These are not things that exist per se. And this kind of set off a whole sort of wave of German idealism from Fichte, Schelling to Hegel. And they tried to like sort of combat dualism and really sort of present arguments for like why sort of the mind is primal. And actually Martin Heidegger claimed that Western philosophy kind of culminated with Hegel. And yeah, it's kind of a nice thing to say of your philosopher friends. And finally, Arthur Schopenhauer, who kind of said, there's the will, kind of this inner essence of reality, but it's a thing. It wants to do stuff. It's like an instinctual thing. So like gravity, that's not just a force. It's like this inner will of reality that's expressing itself. And his book was called Will and Representation, where he described that. And representation is kind of the outside view of it. So kind of in a Kantian sort of way of thinking about things.
James, you didn't mention Spinoza, so do you think you consider him in the panpsychism, or?
I mean, I'm not quite sure. I mean, he was like, God is like everywhere. I think it was more kind of in a religious context. So apart from Berkeley, I'm trying to like be more sort of looking at sort of philosophers, because I think for him it was really kind of like you see God in like everything around you, and kind of that was like the sort of the religious sort of aspect that Einstein kind of liked, where he was like, yeah, I like Spinoza's God, but it was always kind of related to God and not just like sort of idealism. But yeah, you probably could put him in there as well. So the history. What about today? Well, both epistemological and ontological idealism came under massive attack in Britain at the turn of the 20th century by George Edward Moore and Bertrand Russell. So, Bertrand Russell was also a mathematician, and these two guys kind of started what's today known as analytic philosophy. So this is really when philosophy became sort of a serious thing, so very formal, using logic and common sense. So this is kind of like really sort of where this kind of, where there was a turn in philosophy, and it really kind of became hard to understand and read because of this kind of high formalism. And of course, from a rational point of view, idealism is like really silly. It's like this, I don't know, wishful thinking or this philosophical sophistry. It's like, come on, you need to be mature and just accept that, like, reality is random, hasn't got any purpose, there's no gods, there's no cosmic consciousness, and your consciousness is nothing special. I mean, just grow up and just accept what it is. And so that was kind of like, yeah, sort of the feeling there that, I mean, all this thinking about idealism is like, yeah, it's kind of silly. Let's move on. But so why are we talking about this still today? Well, as I mentioned, the renaissance of idealism. So philosophers and scientists who are kind of grappling with these ideas of fundamental reality and consciousness kind of, through stages, come to idealism. And David Chalmers, the guy who posed the hard problem of consciousness, kind of really nicely describes how this evolution kind of looked for him, where he's like claiming he's sort of moving towards idealism. So, first, when he's impressed by the success of science endorsing materialism about everything, and so about the mind. Second, when he's moved by the problem of consciousness to see a gap between physics and consciousness, thereby endorsing dualism, where both matter and consciousness are fundamental. Third, one is moved by the inscrutability of matter to realize that science reveals at most the structure of matter and not its underlying nature, and to speculate that this nature may involve consciousness, thereby endorsing panpsychism. Fourth, one comes to think that there is little reason to believe in anything beyond consciousness, and that the physical world is wholly constituted by consciousness, thereby endorsing idealism. And he's like claiming that's kind of the intellectual path he sort of went through. And, okay, so Max Planck, 1905, he was the person who unleashed the quantum world and all its demons upon us. And already back in 1931, he said, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. So a very sort of staunch idealist exclamation here from one of the greatest physicists of all time. And then we have Robert Kuhn, who through his he has a YouTube channel called Closer to Truth, where he has been in dialogue with over 200 philosophers and scientists, and then he wrote a paper in this year where he kind of tries to show this taxonomy, kind of this landscape of consciousness, where it's on over 140 pages. He analyzes dozens and dozens of different metaphysical ideas from the philosophy of mind. And at the very end, he says, I just don't know. My own hunch right here, right now, if I'm coerced to disclose it and for what it's worth, might be something of a dualism-idealism mashup. So I don't really know what this should mean, but I note that he puts idealism in his mashup. So kind of interesting that after kind of interacting with so many different versions of what consciousness is, that kind of he's I don't know, but it probably is something along the idealism route. So some of the idealists. Amit Goswami, he was working as a theoretical physicist for 3 decades. And in 1993, he wrote the book The Self-Aware Universe, How Consciousness Creates the Material World. So Goswami presents something which he called monist idealism, and where he's consciousness is the ground of all being, kind of this non-dual sort of way of looking at the world. And this is, so he's not coming to this from some sort of religious tradition. This is him as a theoretical physicist, like addressing these enigmas of consciousness. And then we have Thomas Campbell. In 2003, he wrote 3 books. So My Big Toe, which is in physics, it's an acronym TOE for Theory of Everything, which would be like, yeah, quantum gravity. But he's like trying to be funny here. But he's kind of an interesting guy. He was so trained physicist. He worked as a applied physicist. I mean that kind of professionally. And he was involved in the Monroe Institute, which still exists to this day. And they were like doing all kind of funky out-of-body experiments in like the 80s. And in 2003, the CIA declassified this document, which they had in, I think, in 1983. They kind of were looking at this Monroe Institute because they tried to like figure out, can we use out-of-body experiences to spy on other people and stuff? And if you read the this document, you can find it online. It's kind of crazy because they're like, yeah, totally. These experiments worked, and yeah, that was like the CIA disclosing that stuff. And Campbell kind of, so he doesn't really use idealism, but he comes up with this idea of the absolute unbounded oneness. So again, like a name for something we can't envision, cosmic consciousness, whatever. And he kind of tries to sort of, yeah, formalize it a bit, and like how this physical universe is more like a simulation that's computed somehow from this unbounded oneness, which has an intelligence and a purpose. And Erwin Laszlo, in 2016, What is Reality? The New Map of Cosmos and Consciousness, at the age of 83, I think. So, as a child, he was a prodigy pianist in Hungary. So, because of kind of his talent, he was able to travel to the US and get US citizenship, and then he switched to systems theory. So this is like a precursor of complexity theory with like feedback loops and emergence and networks and all that. And yeah, he's kind of a serious scientist, and he kind of presents this idea of the Akashic field, he calls it, from kind of Hinduism. And this is kind of like this, again, this substrate of consciousness which like everything comes out of, again, kind of this idealist idea. And he kind of tries to link it to the vacuum, the 0 point field. So as I said, like, you have all these quantum fields of all the different like particles and forces, and if they're empty, the field is still there doing stuff, and there's still energy in there. So this is like the 0 point energy in the 0 point field, and he's like, hey, that's like the best thing, or the closest thing we can like from physics kind of bridge to this idea of like universal consciousness. And you see that Stanislav Grof wrote the introduction. So he was like the one of the founders of transpersonal psychology, and he was one of the pioneers of psychedelic therapy back in the 60s and 70s. And so they all kind of knew each other, Grof and Laszlo, and I mentioned Christopher Bache, who wrote the book LSD in the Mind of the Universe, where he kind of describes his 20 years of taking 73 high-dose LSD doses, and like describing what he experienced in this transcendental multiverse of craziness with kind of, yeah, going deeper and deeper and deeper into transcendence and metaphysics. And Laszlo kind of endorsed Bache's book, and he wrote the book by Bache is like one of the most important books I have ever read, but it only works if you endorse 3 things. First of all, there's an intelligence behind the things that exist in the universe. This intelligence has a purpose, and it's possible for our human mind to understand some of this purpose. So here, yeah. Well, probably, I don't know, depending on how you try.
No, I think
you maybe get
I think
more.
it's true. Like. And who said that, Laszlo or the other guy?
So Laszlo wrote that about Bache's book
Okay.
in the foreword. So here you have kind of three unlikely people who kind of come from science and like idealism as a metaphysical idea. So it's not only just philosophers, although they are philosophers, like Bernardo Castro. He was a computer scientist turned philosopher of mind, and he came up with his own kind of idealism called analytic idealism. So kind of like the focus again on being very rigorous. So he introduces concepts like Markov blankets from statistics. And as you can see from the titles, so this is 2019, this is like 2021, and this is 2024. So he's getting more bold. So first it was a multidisciplinary argument for the mental nature of reality. And then it's like the fall of matter and the contours of the next mainstream scientific worldview. And now it's like a straightforward summary of the 21st century's only plausible metaphysics. So he's like, yeah, he's on a roll. And actually, he's kind of cool because for this book, it's a compilation of like 12 peer-reviewed publications in different philosophy journals, where each one is standalone. But he planned this already as a book, so he just then compiled them. And he did that because in the beginning, all the philosophers were like, yeah, we don't take you seriously because you just like entered new into philosophy and you have no clue of what you're talking about and you don't have like enough publications. So that's why he was like, okay, sat down, wrote 12 papers, got them published, and kind of kicked off with this book. So he's like, yeah, he's pretty serious about what he's doing. And then we have Miri al-Bahari. So, Perennial Idealism, a mystical solution to the mind-body problem, from 2019. Like this is now really sort of, it's really great to read. You can download it for free, but you see like, yeah, from when I read the quotes, philosophy is really hard because the words, like, it has to be very precise, everything, and it's like these abstract terms and everything, and she does like an amazing job of like presenting how her version of idealism could work. And she chose perennial idealism. So Aldous Huxley, who with mescaline started to get into this sort of more metaphysical ideas, presented perennial philosophy, which is like, hey, there's like a divine presence behind all the things, and you can like interact with it, like what the mystics did. So, Miri al-Bahari says, how are we to understand the notion of a universal world-grounding consciousness that lacks the encompassing perspective of a subject to whom experiences occur? The first step will be to elucidate the central notion of an aperspectival, unconditioned consciousness, one that may serve as a ground for the idealist metaphysics. If mystics have alluded to such consciousness, which they have, it will have been accessed experientially. The central proposal is thus that what appears as our concrete world is in fact built from constellations of cognisensory imagery that frame a subject's perspective. Under perennial idealism, then, the basic brute fact upon which manifestation is to be built is the appearing of a subject, that is to say, imagery to a perspective from the ground of a perspective unconditioned consciousness. You can see here, philosophy is hard, and it's like that's why a lot of scientists are like, come on, this doesn't mean anything. This is just like words, but actually, if you take the time, you understand that this is like very meaningful, and you have to like define things like the cognisensory thing. She defines as specific qualities associated with the different specific sensory and cognitive modalities. Of which then, and then you have to read a whole paragraph and like a whole page to like even understand what this means. Or she has this idea of witness consciousness, which is like the field of just kind of unbounded awareness. And so, yeah, there's like, you can very sort of rigorously, formally and logically talk about these things, idealism, but it's a hard read, but it's definitely worth it because, I really enjoyed that. So, idealism cannot be understood rationally but only experienced. This is the crucial thing. This makes it so hard. But this is kind of the hallmark of all psychedelic experiences. So we're talking about something that is non-dual, aperspectival, unconditioned, non-local, and unified, and it's consciousness. So these are all like attributes. Like, what do these even mean? But again, like, if we listen to the shamans or the mystics, they kind of tell us what this could mean, what this is, like how this feels, and like the meditators. So Mathieu Ricard, he had a PhD, did a PhD in molecular biology, and then he turned to become a Buddhist monk, and he's been meditating ever since. And Diego, who talked last week, so if they ever need meditators to do like brain scans, they take apparently Diego and Ricard. And he was saying that like as science kind of probes deeper and deeper, like with a microscope, and you can try and like figure out what's in matter, you can do the same with meditation into your consciousness. And at one point you just realize you reach the point where it just stops, and there's just this field of just pure awareness. That's how he describes it. And we should also listen to the psychonauts. So these are all kind of masters of consciousness. And this study from this year, endorsement of metaphysical idealism mediates a link between past use of psychedelics and well-being. So what they found is that people who take psychedelics have kind of a shift in their sort of, or have a kind of a spiritual epiphany, because they have a shift in their metaphysical worldview, which is induced by the psychedelic experience, which tends towards idealism, because that's apparently that which people experience during those states. And yeah, I mentioned Chris Leatherby, the philosopher of mind who wrote the book Philosophy of Psychedelics, who was actually saying, this is a bad thing because psychedelics are helping people, but they're inducing these very irrational and untrue metaphysical ideas about reality. This is very bad. But like, apparently, this is in a longer tradition of like what people have been experiencing and talking about. And yeah, you cannot access it rationally. You have to experience it. So it's kind of like a difficult situation, because if you try and like criticize these things, you kind of would have to have made the experience yourself to really be able to talk about it. So that's kind of like a bit of an asymmetry here in the debate. And finally, so
James, one question: how do you define a perspective?
Again, it's like non-dual. It's just like nothing our rational mind can comprehend, but it just means there's like no perspective, but still like coming from like a source of consciousness. I know that doesn't help. So, when I wrote about all this stuff, this is the book, it's coming out next March, at the very end I kind of realized that somehow there's, the problem with idealism is there's like too many sort of subgroups of like, or too many different theories of idealism. And I tried to like bring together like what sort of the main sort of characteristics seem to be that like different idealistic sort of philosophies have. And that's why syncretic meaning like a bunch of like different beliefs put together. And so one thing is that you have this multi-tiered ontology, so you have the physical and the non-physical, the spiritual. This seems to be like one thing you start with. And then, so entelechy is something Aristotle came up with. It's like when something potential becomes actual. And this seems to be very central to what's happening in quantum physics, because somehow quantum physics is like at this boundary of like the potential stuff when it's in superposition, and when it's measured it becomes actual. So this seems to be like the boundary between like this weirdness of like potential and then kind of our actual reality. And this is something that Werner Heisenberg, one of the great quantum physicists, actually talked about a bit, which is for some reason not very well known. And then kind of this idea of the will to complexity. So what we're seeing happening here on Earth seems to be something the universe likes to do. So the universe seems to have an innate kind of arrow or kind of a teleology. It wants to go somewhere, and where it wants to go is more structure, more complexity. Yeah, so life, consciousness, and then we produce computation, and like it seems to be something that is like encoded into, so this should be something physics should figure out at one point, because it's here and it does it, and of course, like most physicists are like, no, there can't be, the universe doesn't have a purpose, it's not going towards somewhere, but apparently that's like what it seems to be doing. And like, I don't know, there's like hints from sort of this non-equilibrium thermodynamics which we kind of understand, like there are these seeds of like, of how kind of, yeah, you can start to sort of have self-organization and complexity kind of emerge in the universe. And kind of here the idea would be that, so once you have kind of assembled complex structures, so for now it's biological, then they can start to channel like from this field, this ground field of consciousness. So this is kind of like a bit of a reinterpretation of Kastrup's dissociated consciousness idea. So he was saying that there's like this thing called dissociated identity disorder, where people have different like personalities, but actually it's like literally, they call them alters. They're like literally different sort of units or kind of perspectives in your mind, and they can shift. And there's like, so for long people thought this isn't a thing, or that these people were just making it up, but like with sort of modern neuroscans, or like there was this one documented case of a woman who had this DID and she was blind, but it turned out that was like the thing of the alters. She wasn't actually physically blind, and she regained her sight after a lot of psychotherapy. So that was kind of Kastrup's idea, that you have this transpersonal field of consciousness, and kind of what we are these alters of like, yeah, kind of personalities that kind of form in this field, the same as it happens in like, so we have one like unified consciousness, but then with this DID you can then still have like manifestations of individual ones. And then you kind of have, yeah, so in the beginning the cosmos is sapient, it's like clever, it like assembles life and computes, but only once consciousness is in there it's like sentient. So the best way to kind of understand that, I find, is with Stephen Wolfram, the physicist, computer scientist, who like 20 years ago said we shouldn't do physics with equations but computationally. And in 2020 he kind of, in 2002 he brought this idea out, kind of called a new kind of science, where it's like, hey, we need to understand reality unfolding computationally. Everyone ignored him, and well, the physicists, and in 2022 he came out again with a much more sophisticated version, where it's like these hypergraphs, multidimensional, updating, whatever. But he kind of came up with this idea of, he calls it the Ruliad, and this is like every possible computation done in every possible way. So it's like the most abstract and general thing, which he claims underlies mathematics and physics. And what consciousness kind of does is, because he then starts to incorporate consciousness, we kind of track sort of paths through this Ruliad. And it's kind of funny because Wolfram was like, my mother was a professor of philosophy at Oxford. I hated philosophy, it seemed so irrelevant and stupid. And now apparently I'm doing philosophy because, yeah, I've started to get interested in these things. So to represent this visually, so this is like this cosmic consciousness field thing. Somehow it kind of, the border, it goes from from the potential to the actual. And this is like this information theoretical idea in physics, that actually from information you get space-time, and then actually the whole of our physical reality unfolds according to computation, the Rulliard. And at one point you have metabolic pathways, life. And within this life you have then kind of our brains, which kind of allow this sort of dissociation from kind of this transpersonal consciousness to our personal kind of consciousness. And somehow what we're doing here is this dance of the physical and the mental, and it seems to be that we're going towards some sort of more complex kind of unified, manifestation in the universe. And if you start to change your consciousness, you can actually go back here. So when you're having psychedelic experiences, you're back in this soup of whatever transcendence. And maybe there's other branching realities going out here. Who knows? So that would be my attempt at trying to understand any of this. So, have we not progressed in understanding fundamental reality and consciousness because we unwittingly adopted the wrong metaphysics? So this is a question regardless of idealism. Physicalism seems to be the wrong way to think about fundamental stuff in the universe, including our own nature. This just appears to be a fact. And can we envision other modes of cognition, like symbolic cognition? So in shamanism, the eagle flying past, or constellations of stars, everything has a meaning. So in shamanism, kind of the universe is full of meaning. And this is something also Carl Gustav Jung was really thinking about. So his idea of synchronicity, thank you. So that accidental stuff happens, but it has meaning. Or that you have kind of the archetypes, kind of these templates of universal meaning. And that kind of the universe is talking to us, you just have to listen. This would be kind of, symbolic cognition. Can we even sort of think about that, or kind of envision that as Western sort of educated minds? And are we actually discovering age-old wisdom? Wisdom which was retrieved through changes in consciousness from the very beginning, with the shamans taking psychedelic substances or inducing trance states. And can idealism break free from the dominance of physicalist and religious ideology? So the idealist has a hard stance, because the physicalist is hey, come on, just accept the universe is just purposeless and random, so kind of this cosmic nihilism, and any meaning you see is just you projecting on it, just grow up, what you're talking about is just ridiculous. And then you have the religious people who are hey, or kind of in our kind of the modern way, our monotheistic religions are enforced. It's hey, we have this external authority you have to obey, and saying that kind of the thing in you is a spark of the divine is kind of heresy, and that's you're just taking yourself too seriously. This is very bad. You should be more humble in the eyes of God, or whatever. So as an idealist, you're kind of, you make everyone your enemy. So yeah, it's not easy. And can we conceive of a scientific spirituality, which is the topic of next week, which is the final lecture? So can we imagine an ensouled universe? Really, seriously, what would that mean? How would this feel? If we think about it and try and switch off our rational mind, can we even access such a concept? Can we does this feel right or totally wrong? And just to be clear, we all hold irrational beliefs if we like it or not. That's just a fact, and most of them we don't even know that they're irrational. So yeah, reframing kind of these ideas, it seems to be that there's actually good case to be made for idealism in the 21st century, which is kind of compatible with the scientific worldview, which makes sense from an intellectual point of view, from different philosophies. So yeah, I hope you kind of rethink your metaphysical beliefs and try and do something with this. Thank you.